and welcome back to Healing Solidarity. I'm Marianne Clements, the initiator of this conference, also a writer and consultant and facilitator of the Replenishment Room. And in this conversation, I am talking with Tina Wallace. Now, I first came across Tina's work when I was an anthropology of development student in the 1990s. And from the work of her and others like her at the time, I learned about the many challenges involved in the difficult and as we talk about in this conversation, complicated work of trying to do what we call international development. What I'm most excited about in this conversation with Tina, I think, is the way that she charts how things have changed since the 1980s, when the way in which development work was funded was very different from how it is today, and the implications of those changes on how we do our work. And what you'll also find is that this is a conversation in two halves. So we recorded the first half 1 week and then unfortunately had some technical issues. And so the second half is recorded, I think it was a week later. And you'll see in the second half, we look a bit more to the future and some recent events that were inspiring us around some of the positive things that we thought, and as Tina explained in the conversation, could change in the way we approach our work. So I hope you all enjoy these conversations as much as I enjoyed having them with Tina. So hi Tina, it's good to be talking to you today. And we wanted to start our conversation by talking about the current drivers for our practice in international development. And the way in which the way we access resources is directing our practice, I guess. Just wanted to ask you a bit about I know you've got years of experience of research and writing about some of these issues. So what do you think the current drivers of our ways of working are? And why are they so strong?
Okay. I'd like to start by saying that when I joined the sector in the UK, when I came back from Africa, and I joined Oxfam first, but I worked with a lot of agencies and we were setting up gender work at that time.
Yeah.
Many of the agencies had very clear guidelines about where they would access funding from. So yeah. I believe that at the time Christian Aid took no government or institutional money, or if they did, it was very little.
Yeah.
The limits for Oxfam were like 10%. Mm-hmm. And there was a very, very clear mood that if you took government or institutional money from big international players, the NGO sector wouldn't be free to set their agendas and do things the way they wanted to do them and have a strong advocacy voice.
Yeah.
And originally, when we dealt with DFID, which was called something else then, but DFID will do, they actually saw the NGO sector as going to places that they couldn't go, as doing things that they couldn't do, that we were to be completely separate.
Like a legitimate alternative.
An alternative, a different way of doing things, setting up pilot studies, reaching people that all governments find hard to reach.
Yeah.
And being a non-government sector.
Yeah.
Now, over the years, we've got a huge, huge shift in that approach, and the drive to become large, to have powerful institutions, to be a voice at the table, has led to NGOs taking very, very large amounts of money from the EU, from the UK government.
Yeah.
And over time, their attitudes have changed. They used to just fund what they thought were interesting ideas. Now they have very clear guidelines, contracts, compliance, results they're expecting. So the way that we're accessing money in the NGO sector has really changed so dramatically, but it was slow. I think we didn't realize, or some people didn't realize how it was changing the way the work was done, until now, when we have more people doing fundraising, more people doing contract compliance, more lawyers, more accountants, more people making sure we fulfill conditions, and far fewer people talking about what we're doing and are the programs any good, and how are we listening to people on the ground, and what say do they have in it. So one example from a few years ago is, a program came from the field through the field office to the UK office to the donor. The UK office and the donor didn't think it was quite good enough. They changed it all and put in lots of new provisos and new requirements. And when people went to the field to see how it was going, they had not even seen the agreement between the UK NGO and the funder. So that's an extreme example, but we've shifted the way we're doing things from trying to work bottom up, being in a very top down situation, where the stakes are very high now. I mean, we are talking about grants of £400 million in some cases. So there's big money to be had.
If you work in that way.
If that's the game you're playing, yes.
And most people are right now.
Yes, I mean, there are a few that are not, some because they fall outside the current priorities. They might like to join, but they're excluded because they're doing different things, and some because they really don't want to work like that, and they want to hold on to the agenda that they believe in and to try and represent the people they're working with more justly. But most people, yes, are caught up in it. Even small NGOs in Africa, you go to work with them and you think, good, I'll get away from this structure. But it turns out their money comes through this structure. So they're also struggling, really struggling with results-based frameworks, databases, indicators, things that actually they don't necessarily even know what they're for.
Yeah, right. I think that's such an interesting memory that it was really different. Are we talking about like maybe, because my recollection of sort of coming into the sector maybe in the 90s is that it's worse now in a sense, but that this was already beginning to happen. So
I'm talking about the mid-80s.
Yeah.
That's when the shifts started to happen, when quite a lot of money was released for things like the Ethiopian famine and the wars in Eritrea and stuff. There was suddenly a big increase in humanitarian aid, and people quite fairly wanted to access that. And then there were changes on both sides. I mean, the donors have definitely over the years become more and more prescriptive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And NGOs, for some reason, have been pretty compliant to and it's not, I know it's not just in this sector. It's, teachers would say the same, doctors would say the same, results, indicators and results sent from the top are dictating what they're doing. But I feel that the sector as a whole hasn't put up much of a fight to say this is not how we want to do it, or this is not enabling us to do what we think will really work for poor people. Or I think it's been a bit passive in pushing back.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. And what I think is also interesting is that I see a lot of, I guess I'd call it lip service paid to some of the things that might sound like they are involving people, around partnership, around consultation with communities, and the kind of language about that still appears in what are actually very top-down initiatives. It might appear in the documents or even in the language that people use when they talk about it, but when you sort of drill into what's actually happening, you realise actually this was imposed by someone in London or someone in, whatever it was. trying to fit into whatever it was the donor wanted and all of that stuff. So it feels like there's a weird way that paying lip service somehow complicates this as well sometimes.
Yes, I think that's right. I think, over the years, particularly a lot of commitment to women and girls and gender equality, but actually very little, a decline in funding to women's organizations. Yes, funding for things around gender within the bigger framework, but not necessarily being run by people who have a passion or who are committed to real change for women. It's almost like the more you say something, the less you do it.
Yes.
I've always felt the more the government talks about transparency, the more sure I am that we don't have it. And there's a lot of talk about, women are at the heart of everything we do. Without women, the world will be a terrible place. But actually, not much fundamental change in the way things are being done, and very little funding for people asking different questions, for radical women's groups, for people saying we can't go on like this and we have to do something more dramatic and more serious to bring change for people right at the bottom. So certainly in terms of staff training, there's a huge shift. So everybody in an NGO will know how to do a results framework and what indicators have to go with what and how they need to collect quantitative data. And very, very few now are really trained in any kind of participatory approaches, in listening skills, in working cross-culturally on sensitive issues. These are not the sort of key training that people are getting.
Yeah, I notice a lot of training courses that I see advertised are, frameworks and that kind of thing. And what I always think is, having tried to deal with them for years, that I still sometimes myself look at them and go, I'm not quite following that. And sometimes I think maybe I'm alone and there's something wrong with me. But the more I talk to people about them, the more I think, actually, there's so much that's missed in them. But maybe
because they're trying to develop frameworks that can work everywhere. There's this sort of thing that we need comparative data and we must have standard measures, and that's okay. And the fact is that development is about relationships, about context, about what actually is happening where you're working, and finding ways to work with that. And well, you may be lucky and some of the bits fit a framework, but many of them simply don't. And to design a framework that would fit everywhere would be thousands of pages.
And even more of a waste of time than the ones that people create now.
Yes, but they are hundreds and hundreds of pages, a lot of them. So I wonder who opens them, actually.
And then that makes me think of, many evaluation reports as well, that I also wonder whoever reads them, and that whole...
Well, they're like a security blanket. I think you can say you've done it, and if something goes horribly wrong, you've got something to look at. But no, they're not guiding what people are doing. A bad evaluation doesn't mean you won't get the next grant necessarily, or a good one that you will, because the decisions are made not so much on performance and the experience of the project, but what you say you're going to do next time.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because you would have thought that past experience, like genuine track record of working in effective ways, ought to.
Yes, but it's who's defining what's effective, and and people who tend to be doing interesting and effective work have a much longer time perspective. They can't show quick results. They can't easily say, yes, we've changed the world in the last 3 years. They're say, you know, most of them would say we're making a contribution. These are steps towards real change, long-term change. Change is actually very difficult for people.
Yeah.
Even small changes in our own lives are very difficult to make.
Yeah.
And we're talking about changing structures and behaviors that have been in place for a very long time.
Yeah.
And I notice also that there's much more focus on changing individuals and getting individuals to behave better or differently, and much less real work going on the structures that keep people poor and that keep women subservient.
Yeah.
I know that advocacy is supposed to do that, but actually there's not very much work at the moment going on by many organizations tackling, you know, power structures at the local level and the national level as well as the international level.
Yeah, and I also sometimes think that a lot of the work that I see that's trying to tackle power structures is very much like trying to work within what's there at the very sort of basic level. So like, you know, we might try to get a little bit more budget for X service. That would be the advocacy, rather than actually this whole system is not really working and it needs in some way to be, you know, pulled down and reconstructed. That's not really in the, you can't put that in a log frame basically. So
no, absolutely. You can't. And the way structural change is understood is very limited. So I feel that when we say we need to tackle patriarchy, I would be talking about laws and actual structures that keep women out of certain forums and so on.
Yeah.
And some NGOs are doing that, but many more are just appear to be saying, well, we must include men, and if we include men, men will change, and then it will all work out differently.
Yes.
As if it's individual men that are the problem. And there's a false dichotomy, sort of women versus men, rather than saying we live in structures that have been very male dominated and we need to start changing those. There are some projects, of course there are some, working on women's representation in parliament and land ownership. But I think if you look at who gets the big funding, those are not the kind of projects that are being funded.
Yeah.
They're much more getting girls into school, accessing services, including men in discussions.
Yeah, so that the including of men in discussions, so that theoretically their attitude will change to their wife and therefore that kind of thing.
Yes, it doesn't really solve the problem that all the judges are men or most of the members of parliament making laws are men, and that traditional attitudes are that men own land and own their wives. You know, we've got to go a lot further.
Yeah.
I'm not saying we impose this on people, but it's interesting that some of the attitudinal work that's been done recently by people like Promundo have shown that attitudes are changing, but much more among women who want more change than men. There was some interesting research in the Middle East saying men are happy for their daughters to go to school now, but they're still not happy for their wives to work or make decisions. Whereas the women are saying, well, now we've got some education, actually, we'd like to speak for ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's all quite complicated. And I think that the NGO world kind of looks at what it does in a situation rather than what are these people's lives like, what's influencing them, what's already changing, how can we work with positive change, and what do we do about negative change?
Yeah. it's like the role of the NGO is somehow inflated in the way that we think about what we're doing. I think about that in fundraising a lot, you know, this idea that, you know, we're presenting some kind of idea of we're going to change people's lives, is actually, it actually feeds into this idea that somehow we're acting, almost we're the only actor, and yet, you know, the reality in all the context where NGOs work is that they're a small, you know, input of some sort, probably, or support in a much more complex context, right?
Yes, yes, and it's interesting, if you go as an employee of an NGO to a country and to projects, you get a very strong sense of those projects and what they mean to people, whether it's good or bad or neither. But when you go as a researcher or as a mentor or an independent, you often never hear about that NGO and its work. And that's right, because they're, however big we get, we're still very small in the context of what government's doing, what religious leaders are doing, what the media is all about.
Yeah,
I think we hugely underestimate what people are learning from the media and what's influencing them.
Yeah.
And I think also now we've hugely underestimated the shift in the importance of religion in people's lives, and the growth of fundamentalism in many places, which is really going to erode many of the things people claim they can do, I think.
Yeah, yeah. So given all of this context, and given sort of what you traced about where NGOs have moved, like, I know you don't necessarily want to answer the question, what should we do?
Well,
but what things would you, like, if you had a magic wand?
I think there are people doing things very differently, and I told you about a conference that was held in 2014 called Development Alternatives. That was run by Queen Mary's, but was held in the British Academy, which brought together people from a huge range of things, including the slow food movement, indigenous groups fighting for land rights, people opposing mining and the damage of mining, women's organizations and peasant organizations that were questioning the use of imported seeds, the need for much more local control of resources. And it was really, really interesting. And the whole way it was run was very interesting. Nobody could come in and give a paper and walk out. People had to, very important people had to commit to the 3 days of being there and participate throughout. So it became quite a deep conversation about what is development, what is the role of outsiders, what is the role of insiders, how can they work better together, when is it appropriate to stand back and let the group most effective make the decisions, and very much looking at how you actually enable things to change. And hearing people who had a real passion for the subject they were talking about, which is where NGOs started. They were all started with people who had a real passion about refugees or displaced people or food security or whatever. And I'm not saying everybody has to be kind of giving their life for it, but it has to be more than just a technical job. Especially if you're working on the ground with people, you know, most people NGOs work with didn't invite them in. The NGO turned up with their offers and so on. And that's fine. And a lot of interesting work is done. But unless we remember that it's real people's real lives, and when we go, they've still got the rest of their life and their children's lives. And they're not living in 3-year projects.
Yeah.
And actually, if you go back to projects that were ticked off as very good, and if there was no follow-up, you often see very, very little on the ground left of the project. And one organization that works long-term in villages did a did a timeline with various villages in Uganda to see what they thought the NGO had contributed and how it had changed. And they were absolutely spot on. You know, they said, well, you used to come and you brought us very practical things and we really liked those, right through to, well, now you just come to train us. You don't actually bring us anything and we're not quite sure how to make the training work. We're trying, but you know, they can see the shifts in paradigms and priorities very clearly, but their lives are still going on. Just and they have the same needs that they had before. So.
Yeah, because none of these interventions are really like structure shifting on the whole. And I guess, cool. Yeah. And I guess structure shifting in reality is like probably like 100-year project. It's definitely not a 3-year or even a 10-year project in some ways. But I do feel like there's definitely something to be said for that context you were talking about, sort of pre-80s or whatever, where NGOs are really like the almost, it sounded like sort of the movement resistance kind of other voice, you know?
The language was very different. I mean, I'm not looking back to a golden age.
No,
very clear that there were lots and lots of issues and problems, a lot of very idiosyncratic.
Sure. Yeah.
Personal characteristics were coming out and so on. But the ability to support what was there or to find people who were there. So, for example, when Comic Relief was started by Jane Chusin, her concept was of a pilot light, that you just go, you know, you can use your money and expertise to support people who look like they're doing something promising.
Yeah.
In Oxfam, the language was about accompaniment. And solidarity. So there was a lot of work with anti-apartheid and the liberation fronts and the peasant movements in Latin America. It's a very long journey from there to every NGO having their own global strategic plan, where they kind of delineate what they're going to achieve in the world. And sometimes you sort of feel, did they know that they're working in independent countries with their own plans? And you know, there's a kind of mismatch between supporting what people are trying to do or opposing it with people who want to oppose it, and saying we are going to be the lead on women's liberation or food security, and this is our plan for the 80 countries we work in. It's just a huge shift in understanding and mentality, I think.
And it definitely is a corporate kind of mentality that's isn't it? It feels like it's behind that sort of. And
well, now your brand, you know, your brand matters.
Yeah.
The brand of the organization.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that's it's a very strange approach to people's lives, to see them as becoming part of your brand, or you need to be able to make lots of claims on behalf of your brand.
Yeah, it is a very strange approach when we talk about it like that. But what I'm noticing, even in the conversation, is that, you know, when I first came into the sector, I absorbed this idea of strategic planning simply because that's what everyone was doing. You know, that there's a way in which we get sucked in, you know, and And when you're talking about, you know, having a strategic plan about all these countries, which have probably way too many plans and way too little implementation of them everywhere. There's a plan, right, these days. But there's a way that we get sucked into it, I guess, because it's a practice we maybe see around us, or we see people doing, or we're asked for it, you know, like funders ask, what's your strategy, what's your plan, so there's it in itself is a whole system, again, that sort of feels like it needs unpacking in a way.
Yes, well, strategic planning is interesting because actually I think a strategy, as it originally was thought about, and I think is used in some other sectors, is something quite flexible that kind of keeps you clear about who you are and what you think you're doing, but can change as you learn, and you don't have to follow it. I feel that, as others have said, that the strategic plans that a lot of NGOs are now using are much more like Soviet 5-year plans. We just plod through them. This is what we're going to achieve, and this is how we're going to measure it, and this is how we're going to tell people that we've achieved what we said we would. Instead of saying, okay, well, this was our idea, but actually that didn't work terribly well, or the feedback is quite problematic, so we'll adjust.
Yeah.
So I'm not against having a sort of broad strategy, but I certainly think strategic plans that now say we're going to grow by this much, we're going to be the lead agency on this, which many of the strategies of big NGOs are much more about what they're going to do.
Yeah.
I think I suppose what I would really say is we have to get back to saying, how are we going to support or enable things to change for the people in whose name we raise our funds?
Yeah.
And not see ourselves as knowing the answers or having the way to do it, but being able to learn as we go along and to talk about it. I mean, when I first joined NGOs, the conversations were all, you know, what is the best way to enable a farmer to do X or Y? Or what are we going to do about this organization that wants to do this? What would be right? What's not right? Most of the conversations now are what are the priorities of the donors? How to fill out all these forms? How are you getting on with Kofi or KPMG or Pricewaterhouse? How do we manage them? It's a very different set of conversations.
Yeah, I noticed recently there was a bond email about, and I don't remember what they all are, but basically the priorities of organisations in the sector, and they were all, I think, or almost all, those things.
Yes.
Funding donors, those are the things that concern and worry people, because they're the things that mean they go, as it were, out of business or not, I guess. And so they've ended up focused very much there, to the detriment of really anything about the people they want to help.
I think the voices and the needs of the people they're working with, it's very, very difficult to get them into the conversation now. So a lot of consultants that I know would say, yes, we've talked to your staff in the field, we've talked to your partners, we've talked to people in the village. These are some of the questions they're raising. These are some of the things they like. These are some of the things they find very problematic. When you sit around the table with the senior management team, feeding that back, it's very clear what will and what won't be heard. And even when you're quoting people and you keep saying, no, this is not my idea, this is what they're saying, there's a huge resistance if people on the ground are saying, actually, this is really not what we needed, or the way it's being done is quite disempowering, or we don't feel heard. It's very difficult now to get these heard in the hierarchy. The knowledge definitely comes from the top at the moment rather than from people on the ground. And of course, people on the ground don't say what we want them to say, and they don't think what we want them to think, and they're very complicated, and they're very demanding, and sometimes they're very angry, and it's not easy.
Yeah.
This is not easy work. It's complicated work.
Yeah. But sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
No, the idea that any feedback about programs is sort of something to be resisted. I've definitely encountered that as well with organisations where it's like, you know, I've gone and interviewed people and asked them what they thought, and essentially, you know, there's been some feedback that maybe isn't brilliant about the organisation, and then the response to that is, well, trying to avoid that being written in a report, essentially.
Yes, lots of things, and some quite strong-arm tactics.
Yeah.
When I was in charge of doing evaluation in one NGO, I was often asked, well, can you ask them to change that? And I said, well, if we're not a bit independent as evaluators, then we're not going to learn anything.
Yeah.
But now I don't think there's a sense that it should be an independent learning. For a lot of organizations, it's about proving that you've done what you said you were going to do.
Proving that you're good at your job.
Yeah.
Hi, Tina, it's good to be back.
Hello.
We're excited this week a little bit because there's been some good stuff that we wanted to talk about, right?
Yeah.
Let's talk about it.
Okay, yes. I mean, I was very interested to see that there's a big article signed by 15 of the great and the good Nobel Prize winners and world-class economists, saying really what it is that I think a number of us have been saying for a long time, that the way development is being done is not promoting long-term sustainable structural change, and therefore it's not achieving any of the things it's set out to achieve. And in the article that was in The Guardian, these 15 people particularly focus on things like, you know, the notion that you can measure effective change in the short term with simple quantitative measures, with targets, with short-term results, and with single focus. So you pay teachers a bit of a bonus and they respond well to that, but when you finish, the system hasn't changed. There's no better teacher training, there's no salaries for teachers across the country, and so it all disappears again. Yeah. And they pick up on all the things, I think, that we were talking about before. Very top-down, donor-driven, INGO solution-driven projects that, you know, may do good things for people in the short term, but are not changing anything. They're not addressing the causes of change or the causes of poverty. And it's interesting to me that suddenly there is a bit of noise being made in a few quarters that this is not okay, and that setting up projects that spend millions and millions on keeping girls in schools for 2 extra years, when it finishes, nothing major has changed. A few people's lives have been changed, but girls' education and what they're learning and the quality of the teaching and the lack of books continues. So they've put in a very strong statement that's saying the billions and billions of dollars spent are being wasted. I'm not sure I'm saying it's all wasted, but I am saying that these are the issues we've been concerned about for a long time. And I think we have got to find a way to get this discussion going, particularly in the UK, because we hold a lot of the power about how development is conceptualized, who gets funding for what. And, you know, what we were talking about last time after we finished the interview was there are very different ways of doing this. And perhaps a lot of people don't know that. because it's become so overwhelming, the packages that we're following at the moment.
Yeah, it was so interesting to see, you know, lead economists, not that I necessarily knew anything about most of their work, but that they were saying those exact things, looking presumably from quite a macro level, not necessarily even asking the questions about community involvement, participation, the kind of things we might also want to ask, but still coming to that conclusion actually, you know, which we knew, right? But it was kind of good to have it echoed back from somewhere slightly different, you know.
Well, I think it's important. These are significant players. I don't know how much notice people take of them. We'll have to see, but they're not insignificant, and they are taking on some of the dominant ideologies that are being promoted through a lot of the big philanthropic and government donor organizations. And I think it gives people who are very uneasy with what's going on a bit more of a platform to say, look, it's not just a few lunatics who look back and think there are different ways of doing this and we could do it better, but these are actually people, as you say, not looking at it from a community perspective, but from a global perspective, saying this is not making any sense.
Yeah.
And we could go on doing this forever.
Yeah.
And if we're not changing any of the structures that prevent good healthcare being delivered, or that prevent teachers doing a good job, or that address issues of inequality, you know, we're just pouring water into buckets full of holes.
Yeah.
and measuring smaller and smaller things as achievements and proof of effectiveness. I think that was interesting. You know, you can say that, you know, more medicines were delivered to more people over the 2-year period, but it doesn't tell you anything about the quality of healthcare for most people.
Yeah.
Focusing on very minute things that prove we're doing a great job is actually not helping us to see what's working and what's not working and what could be done differently.
Yeah. And it also, like, just in that example, I think about medicine, it sort of detracts from the structural questions, actually, doesn't it? And I think they probably say that in the article, that actually looking at those things it's not just not the right measure, it's also actively makes you focus on something that isn't the change, really.
Yes, absolutely. So the measures in some of these very big multi-million pound projects are very, very tiny and not to do with what is the real change going on, either in the lives of women or girls or whoever, or in the structures in which they work. So there's a lot to think about there.
Yeah.
And after we talked last time, I was thinking, you know, it's not that there's one way of doing all this. There's not one solution. There isn't a magic bullet, which is a development has always looked for magic bullets as it's jumped from participation to microfinance to aid effectiveness to value for money. You know, maybe there are multiple ways of doing this, but to actually think about what to do and how to do it requires that we stop thinking that we have answers, that we know what the answer is, that we come up with yet another theory, yet another approach, yet another sort of system, and impose it right across the board. And at the moment, that means that this focus on collecting complicated quantitative data on very small issues is completely squeezing out the involvement of people in assessing what's working for them, in what has value for them, in what their needs are. And I'm not saying that you just ditch everything we've got now and go back to just community level approaches. But I'm saying, I feel we really need to stand back and get clear what role people outside of a country have in trying to support and enable and encourage or whatever social change that has meaning for people on the ground. And it is very complex, and it isn't going to be quick, and it never is quick. So a little bit more humility, a little bit more working in cooperation, working in a coordinated way, and much better learning. I mean, I'm afraid that monitoring and evaluation, which never used to be done at all, we never had any 20 years ago. People didn't even know what it was. We've now got it up to the gunnels, and it's almost running a lot of projects, but focused on such tiny issues and very concerned to prove success. And we're not learning. We're not learning. It's very difficult, actually, if you read a lot of evaluations, to find out what really happened and where there were good triggers and where the problems were, because they're not designed for that anymore. They're designed to count people and prove that you delivered what you said you would deliver.
Yeah.
And the voices of the people affected are more and more excluded and marginalized. In fact, they rarely get asked anything at all, I think, very often.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a massive difference, isn't there, between proving that you did what you meant to do and learning anything about change. But it's funny how they can almost sound the same. Like evaluation, it sort of gives the promise of doing both those things. But in my experience from reading a lot of evaluations, I agree that I seldom learn much about the latter. You know.
Yes, and a lot of evaluations are raising, a lot of evaluators do raise issues that are not very comfortable for the people, particularly in the UK, to hear. But then they're being kind of suppressed. They're not being shared. We're not talking about what are some of the really, really difficult problems that we're trying to work with, and where there are successes. And I think on a more positive note, I just wanted to say, you know, there are some smaller projects that I am very familiar with where there are real successes and there are real changes that are measurable and of value to the people. And as just a couple of examples, one would be Stepping Stones, that's worked for 20 plus years on HIV/AIDS, where it was life and death. So actually there wasn't messing about. You had to come up with some pretty good stuff to try and save lives and help people cope with a huge epidemic. Yeah. And I think Stepping Stones was built as a long-term community-based training and awareness raising and set of support structures that people engaged with over a long time. The training was like over 18 months and done with children, boys and girls, women and men, different age groups, who then came together to share their ideas and the issues they faced. And that's grown into a community of practice all over the world where people adapt the training to their own contexts and discuss the issues. And it's a very lively debate. There's always learning going on. There are always things that need to be changed and improved. And they've recently got a manual for children, just working with children with HIV. And the results coming out of that have been measured by, you know, proper statistical measures show that this is empowering the children to feel in some sort of control of their lives living with HIV. Mm-hmm. But it's not quick. It can't be done in huge numbers. It has to grow incrementally. It requires a lot of people to be involved and get trained and understand the issues. But I think, you know, there are lots of projects like that that are slow, have been developed with communities and government health services and the WHO, and over time established themselves as reputable and therefore are being replicated. And it's a very different way of working, and they find it very hard to get funding because of the numbers issue.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another project which I'm very fond of in India, training women to be taxi drivers. And it was actually the first project in India that dared to say women could drive cars and be bus and taxi drivers. And that project's sort of 12 years in, and they would say they're just really understanding what it really requires to take a young woman from the slums and enable her to become a professional businesswoman, taxi driver, knowing all the legal and technical issues and understanding her rights and building her confidence. And it's a very hard road for these young women to take, but some of the results are now coming out. Again, hard to fund because it's long term, it's slow, but it's now you're seeing more and more people starting to copy this, and it will actually have a huge impact, I think.
Yeah.
But it couldn't be measured in the first 3 or even 5 years.
Because
so it's
sorry, carry on.
No, go on.
I was going to say, because initially, I'm imagining now, I'm making it up, that they were working with a small group and trying to figure out what they needed and that kind of thing. And it just takes a lot longer than we imagine when we say, oh, we'll try it for 3 months and then a thing will.
Yes, I mean, they imagined that they had to teach women to drive, which is a huge thing. They imagined they had to build their confidence to leave the slums and come into town and learn to drive. They imagined that they might need financial support to attend these courses because they wouldn't be able to earn money as they were before. But they didn't understand the complexity of these women's lives and how difficult it is for them to break stereotypes and norms and to confront their families and to make demands on their husbands or their fathers, and the complexity of organizing their lives while they're away, when they can't be looking after their kids, and who's going, you know, and the stipends were often used for medicine for the kids because there was an emergency and then they'd run out of money. So over time, it's become a more and more elaborate training program that involves equally as much confidence building, women's rights, dealing with authorities, how to manage the police, how to avoid being forced into paying bribes, etc., as learning how to drive a car and keep it going on the road.
Right.
So, you know, once you're really doing something that's changing people's lives, it's a huge journey for them.
Because the reason then women weren't, you know, and this would apply to so many other things, that they weren't doing it wasn't just because they didn't know how to drive.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, the very basic things is these women don't have identity papers. They don't have any birth certificates or documents saying who they are. So when they went to get their provisional driver's licenses, it's like, well, no, you can't start there because we don't know who you are. So they had to go several steps back to sort out how to get basic identity documents, and so it went on. So it was a slow process and a hard process, but for me shows actually what's needed if you're really talking about transforming people's lives rather than enabling them to earn an extra $3 a month doing what they were doing before.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, or maybe I'm just thinking, again, if that had been projectized after 3 years, it might have been, here are all the things that haven't quite worked. They didn't have papers, so we couldn't teach them to drive, so we did something else, or whatever it would be. Probably wouldn't have, and then maybe the project would have ended because it wouldn't have shown enough impact
Yes,
or something, or it wouldn't have got funded again because it would need to be something new or whatever that is, and you'd actually
in that,
lose all this
in
quality.
that in that case, as in other cases that I could also quote, they had a philanthropic donor who made the decision to invest long term. So they were not investing in a project, they were investing in the organization and checking that they were learning and listening and developing and evolving. And they had, a 10-year funding. And that's actually, if you look into a lot of projects that are doing things differently, that's actually more of the pattern, that people are given the money, and of course they have to report, and of course they have to account, but in different ways about how they're developing the programs and the organization. And a long time ago, there was a big move to say, instead of projects and instead of project funding, funders should invest in organizations and give them enough money to buy buildings, to create income generating opportunities, and then they can decide how to use the money and how to account to the people they work with and the government in the country. So we have thought that this was a good way of doing things, and then it didn't come to very much in the end.
That's true. I
And
remember
we've gone very much back to projects, even for these multi-million pound things. It's 4 years or 6 years maximum, and very focused on small results.
And I think it seems to be partly driven by the fact that basically people making the decisions about what fund is going to be used for haven't gone on this journey that we've described of understanding what change really looks like. And I don't quite know how we make that happen, but that feels crucial. Maybe this letter from The Economist is like a helpful insertion in that, because it seems like people that are making decisions about massive amounts of money just don't seem to be carrying that sort of awareness.
Well, and increasingly, one of the problems is this contracting out. So the big players running development programs with huge budgets are actually largely from the accountancy firms and the private sector, it's not been their job. They're not development specialists. They haven't worked in development. I'm sure there's some very good people in them who have, but as firms, they're about very different things. They're about accounting and bottom lines, and they're trying to manage things that actually they don't understand or know the details of. And although in theory they hand those over to the NGOs they subcontract, actually they're very prescriptive in lots of ways. So actually people is sort of holding these big projects are not development experienced people. And I'm sure they're learning, and I think that they all have some great people working in them, but the structures are not development structures.
Yeah.
And for some reason, the NGO world seems to have lost confidence in what it learned, and is sort of taking from other people and learning how to do it their way. And a lot of lessons that actually we've learned repeatedly in development I feel are beginning to come out now, and people saying, oh, do you know if you educate a woman, it improves the lives of her children? And somebody sent me an article proving this recently, you know, from a very long-term big research project. And I said, yes, but we knew that in the 70s. You know, there was a lot of research telling us this in the 70s. Why don't we listen to what we've actually learned and build on that? But people sort of feel, unless it's now a big quantitative, trialed, evidenced findings, it didn't count. But actually, there's tons of data out there all across the world in PhDs and NGO files showing we do know a lot about what works and what's needed.
Yeah, and one of the things I noticed in that letter from The Economist was a real skepticism about whether, you know, RCTs and trials were actually useful in context of change in society, you know?
They can't be, because you can never control, you know, the controls are not, there are too many variables to do a proper randomized controlled trial.
Yeah.
And the ethics are very problematic. And the costs are astronomical. And too much money now is going on measurement and proving X, Y, and Z, and not, you know, there needs to be a lot more focus on what are we doing, how are we doing it, what are people saying, what's working for them, who's benefiting, who's being left out, how might we do this better? Very simple questions that I think we've really lost track of somewhere along the way.
Mm. Before we started the recording, we mentioned the letter from Danny at Civicus, which I haven't read, but which you have also read this week. Do you want to say something about
Yes, well, I haven't read it in detail, but Danny, who's been the head of Civicus for the last 5 years, who's moving on now, based in South Africa, but representing civil society around the world, has written a very hard-hitting thing saying, I think the headline is NGO, you know, big NGOs have become lazy and complacent, and that the focus is on keeping the NGO going, getting in the funding, getting the profile, being out there, being important, and that the work needed to actually understand how to bring change to poor people is not driving the organizations. There's a huge focus on growing and, you know, being seen and being big. But it's obviously, it's more complex than that. But it's a very, again, it's a big hitter saying, actually, this is not okay. No, yeah. 20 years ago, well, we didn't really have strategies, but whatever we had, were very much focused on the work with poor people. And slowly, you know, the strategy of growth and being a significant actor in the sector and having a high profile has grown and grown and grown until for some NGOs, you know, growth of the organization is their number one strategic aim. And he's saying this is not okay.
Yeah.
And these things are squeezing out the room for very different kinds of debate and asking different kinds of questions. And I think that's what I'm most concerned about, is there's a sort of dominant paradigm that is excluding all the diversity and all the challenges we need to be thinking about. And some people say, oh, that's terribly depressing, it's too complicated. But actually, it's really exciting. It's a lot more exciting than wondering where you're getting your funding from. How do you help? How do you support a farmer in an increasingly drought-prone area? Do something meaningful that will keep the land alive and keep food growing and improve their lives. You know, these issues are challenging, but they're also very interesting. And there's lots of people out there to work with we could learn from.
Yeah, it feels like what we need is basically these different structures, in some sense. And I don't quite, well, I don't know what they look like at all, but they definitely need to have more space for the complexity and questions and messiness and all of that. And it feels like these very I guess corporate style structures and solutions just exclude that deliberately somehow.
Well, they exclude it because they take so much time. Those discussions and demands and paperwork and take so much time. There isn't much room for the other things. But there's lots of interesting organizations dotted around all over the world, and maybe there are ways of better supporting them and better linking them and allowing people in who are asking questions differently and raising different challenges. And at the moment, the funding is not flowing their way at all.
Yeah, and that's deeply depressing when you find really interesting work that has no money, knowing that there's work that has money that you feel not so keen on. It can feel really depressing how hard it is for even just small scale interesting projects to get a little bit of money. Can sometimes be
yes,
such a challenge.
It is. It's extremely worrying, and there are trends, and the trend is not to support small grassroots organizations doing things their way. If they get funding, they're being pushed to do things in ways they don't necessarily want to do it.
Yeah.
And certainly women's organizations and the Association for Women in Development keep saying, you say women are very important to development, but actually the funding for women's organizations has dropped and dropped and dropped.
Yeah.
And that's different from funding a big project for girls' education, which is designed far away and rolled out across 28 countries and costing millions. That's not the same as giving money to women fighting for rights and to combat barriers to the progress of girls and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
And as I say, we might need all these things, but at the moment, the more challenging, the more radical, the more questioning, the more demanding voices are certainly being squeezed out in a lot of development debates at the moment.
Yeah. So we want to challenge that.
And I think that's enough.
Thank you so much, Tina. You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Tina Wallace, and this is the Healing Solidarity Conference. Thank you so much for joining us for this conversation today. If you'd like to spend a bit more time with the ideas and suggestions we discussed in this talk, or any of the others that are part of the conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of this event and get access to recordings and ongoing conversations about these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more. Thank you.